looking at the economy, how do you see the U.S. economy 5 years after the Great Crash?
Well, I think it's actually largely healed. The evidence we have from previous studies of crises, it tends to take 5 to 7 years to get through the process of deleveraging and so forth. Now, the U.S. economy clearly has some very, very big issues and problems. I think rising inequality and the plight to the middle class are the most important. Structural problems. The long-term trend growth issue. How fast will the economy grow in the longer term? That's, I think, a very, very big issue. But in terms of dealing with the crisis, the US is clearly ahead of anywhere else. The deleveraging has been very substantial. There's been a big reduction in household debt with default, which is sad, but it's happened. The financial sector is clearly healthier. And lots of problems in it, and we can see this with J.P. Morgan, for example, but the financial sector is clearly much, much healthier. The housing market has corrected. You've got a big energy boom. Energy prices here are lower than in any other developed country, and you're becoming largely energy self-sufficient. There's still a very powerful, innovative engine here, though you need to continue to fund the research, which has been the basis of this, and that's a government function, a fundamental government function, but innovation is still there. So, and you survived really quite well this year, a massive fiscal tightening. We've had an enormous fiscal tightening, about 3% of GDP.
With the sequester.
That's the sequester, and
which is really budget cutting.
And exactly, it's too much, and it should have been done in a different way. I think the tightening has been far too much. You could have had a much stronger economy, a much lower unemployment if you hadn't tightened the fiscal position by about 3% of GDP. And now the fiscal deficit is 4% of GDP. It's fallen by about 7 percentage points in the last 3 years. So it's a massive shift. And yet the economy is growing. So I actually am quite confident, if nothing disastrous happens in this sort of area, that we might see 2 or 3 years, maybe longer, of really strong growth in the US, and it will look a very, very good post-crisis recovery.
But the sequester, which began early this year, is supposed to deepen in the new year,
yes.
In 2014. That's not promising.
Well, this is where the budget discussions go. I don't know what deal they will do, but I would hope that they would focus on where the issue really lies, which is the very long term, way into the 2020s and 2030s, focusing particularly on the health costs issue, which is the core fiscal issue in the US, and not tighten the sequester. Indeed, they should get rid of it. They should have a more rational budget process. I think actually the US is clearly cutting the economic functions of the government too far. It's basically being reduced to just defense, interest, Social Security, and Medicare. There are other things government needs to do which are shrinking dramatically to a tiny proportion of national income. I think it's a tremendous mistake. So I think you should relax budget, not tighten further. So there is a worry there.
Would you agree that despite what happened this week and the political victory that President Obama seems to have won, would you agree that the conservatives have really won the argument about government?
I think that is true. What has surprised me is how little pushback there has been from the Democrat side in arguing that the government really did have a very strong role in supporting the economy during the post-crisis recession, almost depression, that the stimulus argument was completely lost, though the economics of it were quite clearly right. They needed a bigger stimulus, not a smaller one. It helped, but it didn't help enough because it wasn't big enough. And they're not making the argument that government has essential functions which everybody needs in the short run. Well, we can see that with the national parks, but also in the long run. The strength of America has been built, in my perspective, particularly in the post-war period, since the Second World War, on the way that actually the public and private sectors have worked together, with the government providing enormous support for research and development. It's been the basic support of America's unique position in scientific research. You look at the National Institutes of Health, which are the most important medical research institutions in the world. These are all products of the willingness of the United States to to invest in the long-term interest. Then there's the infrastructure. Think of the highway program, which was the most important infrastructure project under the Republicans, interestingly. And those arguments seem to have been lost. So I am concerned that the government, that I think Grover Norquist once said he wants to drown in the bath. If you drown your government in the bath, in the modern world, we don't live in the early 19th century. It's a different world. That the long-term health of the United States will be very badly affected. It's strange to me that a government which has obviously achieved very important things, think of the role of the Defense Department in the Internet, has achieved such important things. It's just one of many examples. It should be now regarded as nothing more than a complete nuisance. And the only thing you need to do is to cut it back to nothing. And it does seem to me that the Democrats have, for reasons I don't fully understand, basically given up on making this argument. And so, in a way, the conservatives, the extreme conservative position has won because nobody is actually combating it. So it's only a question of how much you cut and how you cut it, rather than, well, what do we want government for? What are the good things about it? What are the bad things about it? How do we make it effective? And how do we ensure that it's properly financed?